All right, everybody. Thank you all for attending. This is kind of our webinar that we always have to showcase the new features in the coming release of our Estimator product. Really excited about the things we have to show today. Today marks a change a little bit in direction on how we are working with quantity takeoff, specifically with 2D, but there are a handful of other additional features that have been included in this. A lot of the feature set, if not maybe entirely all of the feature set, has been driven from our industry advisory board members. So for those of you who are a part of that board, thank you very much. For those of you who are not, one of the things, if you're not familiar with it, it is a group of people who are really passionate about our technology and about trying to solve problems in pre-construction and estimating, who, even if they're not a client of ours, are willing to take the time to provide good feedback and to help us create great technology and great solutions. And they help us refine some of the pieces as we move along. And so I want to thank everybody who's contributed and kind of offer out to everybody the option to contribute if you can. There is not, this is, so for those of you who've been kind of following Estimator, you know that this release came pretty quickly on the heels of our last release. This is our 2017 3.0 release. It is the third release this year. We are hoping to get a fourth release in this year as well, but it may slip in the next year depending on the size of that release. This feature set is a little bit smaller than some of our huge feature sets in the past because we have been trying to get a lot of this out faster. We want to make sure that we got it to you as fast as possible. So with all of that, I'm going to jump in and just kind of walk through some of the larger features that are in 2017 3.0. I want to start, hopefully everybody can see my screen. I'm going to jump over to our takeoff window for a second. So here I've just got a simple estimate that I created before this meeting, added a handful of 2D quantity takeoff objects just so we'd have something to talk about. I priced some of those, some of them I left unpriced just to kind of showcase this new feature set and to give you some flavor of what we're looking at now. So for those of you who are not quite familiar with our application, what you're seeing, I'm presenting from a laptop. It is small, so I've got a lot of windows up. What I will do is I'm going to hide this window just for a second to give us more real estate. So I've got a drawing that I've pulled up here. It's one of a handful of drawings that I've associated with this estimate. And then you can see in this section, this is what's known as our takeoff summary. This is pretty much always been a part of Estimator since we've had the integration with 2D quantity takeoff. But it's not something we've talked about a lot to date. So some of you may not be familiar with this. Long story short, this shows you, this sort of summarizes the quantity takeoff that has been done for this estimate. And there's a little slider up at the top here that's also been here for quite some time that lets you see what's either on the current drawing that you're looking at, or if I slide this, it'll show me all the takeoff done across the entire set of drawings. We added a couple of items, but the bigger changes were more around the fact that quantities jumped significantly because I have the same types of takeoff done on the other sheets as well. So I'm going to slide that back off just for a second just to show you what's done on this sheet. Let me zoom in here so you can see this a little better. The first and one of the main features inside of 2017 3.0 is a change in how we tie costs to the quantity takeoff objects in 2D. So in the past, what we would do is you'd select the objects here, and then from here you can hit add on an assembly, create one-off. And that worked fine, but it was a little slower than people kind of like to work. You can still do that now, we didn't take that away. But it also didn't necessarily work the way that a large proportion of estimators like to work with their quantity takeoff on their estimates, which is they don't necessarily want to price any given particular room or wall per se. They just want to get the total quantity of 1 hour wall or carpet or tile and associated costs with that. So we support that much better now by allowing you to use our takeoff summary to tie costs to these components. So now you have two different ways that you can associate cost with your takeoff. Under the hood, it all basically does the same thing. This is just a little bit faster. So what I can do, if I can select any one of these, say select 1 hour wall here, you'll notice everything selects. Because I'm currently only looking at the components on the drawing, on this drawing that I'm shown, when I select a 1 hour wall here, it's only going to highlight and select the 1 hour wall on this drawing. If I were to toggle this and say show everything on all drawings, when I select this, it's now selecting the 1 hour wall across the entire project. Now, I'll get into it here in a little bit. There are ways to break this down even further, so I might want to select the 1 hour wall from floors 1 to 5 and not get the next 10 floors. You definitely can do that as well, and I'll talk to that here in a little bit. But I wanted to show you that now by selecting this, I can come in, I can say, hey, I want to add an assembly. I'm going to bring up my assemblies. Here I can say, hey, let's look at my 1 hour. I'll bring up 1 hour wall. And it's going to show me, as it always has before, this is the quantity takeoff objects. Here are the different parametric variables that I can map. You'll notice right here I've got multiple values. So the height of some of these walls that I've selected is different. So just because I kind of bulk picked across the entire project, I've got some that are maybe 13 feet, some that maybe 15 feet or 8 feet walls. But for this case, I might just want to take and drag and map the area or the length of the wall. So here it's asking me about the interior wall length. Here it's asking me about the height. Obviously, I can't map this because it has more than one value. So I can either pre-answer this, or I can go back and say, hey, I just picked off way too much quantity takeoff. I need to segment out my walls by height and grab them individually by height, which you can do as well. And we can talk to that here in a little bit too. As always, I can classify where those costs go. I can hit OK, and now I've just priced. I put a single assembly to all of my 1 hour wall, which brings me to another change in how we are now working with costs inside of DESTINI Estimator. Now, in previous versions, what we would do, if I selected 200 different 1 hour wall segments, and I tied an assembly to that wall, under the hood, what would happen is you'd have 200 assemblies all rolled up to look like one assembly. But what that gave you the ability to do is I can select any of these walls, and I can see the exact price of that wall, and then edit the assembly, the single assembly associated with that wall segment. But the struggle that provided a lot of our existing clients was that I now have to kind of sift through some of this data at times, and I've got 200 assemblies. We worked really hard on trying to make sure the user interface boiled that down, and you never really got exposed to the data. But one of the problems that we did struggle with was around performance. So you'd end up having, tens of thousands of assemblies, and even more line items inside of an estimate, and it would bog it down a little bit, especially when you wanted to try to flatten everything out and view holistically the entire thing. And so one of the changes that we are making in 2017 3.0 is if I select 200 different wall segments and I tie an assembly to it, I've added one assembly to those 200 different wall segments. Now, if I modify any one of these wall segments, just like it has in previous versions, it will update that assembly if the parametric variable that I associated with that costing was modified. So in this case, the length, I tied the length of all these walls to that assembly, to a question in the assembly. If I now drag any one of these walls and make it longer or shorter, it's going to update assembly takeoff automatically for me, and the cost will reflect that. So you still get all that same functionality. The benefit, of course, is that it's a heck of a lot faster now, and it's a heck of a lot easier to manage and wrap your head around, and it fits much better with how estimators think about their estimates and interacting with their costs and displaying those costs. All right, moving on, one of the other things that we can do, and I kind of mentioned this before, is you can segment this information now. So I want to try to kill two birds with one stone here. We have the ability now to group this takeoff summary. And one of the things that I want to group by is a new property that we have. So I'm going to go bring up my column chooser, and you can see all of the different properties that you can currently add. You can drag and drop out into this takeoff summary to view the data. And then, of course, this list is as long as you want it to be, because this includes every single custom property that you may have associated with your takeoff components in the past. But one of the ones that we've added that was not there before is this is mapped property. So I'm going to drag that and just drop it right up here in our group header. And what this is it's a way for us to now see which takeoff components have been mapped to cost and which ones have not. So in the case here where I've gone through and I just tied every single 1 hour wall to an assembly, you can see that's showing up as mapped. So is my slab-on grade takeoff and my composite tile takeoff. But if I come back in and I draw another 1 hour wall, I'm going to have some quantities that are now not mapped. Now I can quickly go in, just like I did before, and associate all the new walls with that existing assembly. We support that, and it works exactly the way you just saw me do it, where I select it. We have some new stuff around reviewing and updating your quantities that I'll show as well. But you can definitely associate that with the new cost, or I can quickly see, hey, I've got some 1 hour wall that has yet to be associated, and I want to handle that differently. And I can see those takeoff components that are not currently driving cost. Not only can you use that property here in our takeoff summary, you can also use it here in our filter. So what I'm going to do is just to show you, I've currently broken down my estimate and my takeoff by unit formats, going down from 1 to level 3. But I'm also going to add my is mapped cost here. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just drive that guy right up to the top so I can see the stuff that is unmapped and the stuff that is mapped. And then quickly what I can do, I'm going to shift over to my estimate view. So this is kind of where my costing lies. And now I can see, obviously, anything that has cost is going to be mapped. So if I click anything below here on unmapped, it's going to just go blank pretty much instantly for anything that is tied to or not tied to a component. In this case, I have unmapped cost, which means I have applied costing outside of my quantity takeoff. So that might answer the question of why do I have breakdowns for unit format that have been mapped and unmapped? These costs here have been added, in this case, added directly to the estimate and not associated in any way with quantities. And then if I come back to the map cost here, these costs have been added to the estimate and associated with quantities. So that could have happened either like you saw before, where I picked some quantities and then I added costs, or that could have happened where I had some existing costs and I came into my estimate view and I said, hey, I want to drive the quantities for these line items and these assemblies by my quantity takeoff and not from manually entering the quantities or answering the questions directly. So this is another way that you can look at this information. And then, as always, our filter will filter both the estimate and the takeoff at the same time. So here, if I select a substructure, and it's kind of hard to see because it's the entire slab on grade, but maybe if I go to something a little bit more, let's go to interiors. If I select interiors, now you can see all of the interiors sections, so all the walls in this case, that have been mapped to cost, which is those 1 hour walls you just saw me map to, that 1 hour wall assembly earlier. But if I wanted to look at maybe some of the, let's see, substructure, in this case shell, so nothing looks like on this drawing. One of the things I'm going to do just to show you some of the takeoff that is not mapped is I'm going to remove our unit format classification and just bring in our component name for a second. So what this is going to do is it's going to organize by, hey, here's everything that's been mapped to cost, and then underneath it, broken down by the actual quantity takeoff name or the quantity takeoff in my filter view. So now I can see that unmapped, I've got 2 hour walls, I've got some composite tile, or carpet tile here, so I can quickly filter through, or I can just select everything unmapped and show on my 2D drawing everything that's unmapped. The other really nice thing that this property gives you is it gives you the ability to deconstruct your quantity takeoff. Now, we've kind of always had this, but it wasn't really straightforward, and you had to use other properties of the estimate to make that happen. This makes it a lot easier to do. So now as I come through here, I can select anything. So in this case, I've got composite tile. If I want to just add a line item to this tile, I'm just going to select it directly instead of using the takeoff summary, just to show that you can go both ways with this. I'll just do ceramics for quickness sake. So I'm going to map the area to the quantity. They're both in square feet, so that worked out great. Hit OK, and then as I do it, you'll notice it disappears. So now I'm deconstructing my takeoff, and I could have done that here in the takeoff summary as well. But I can deconstruct my takeoff, and so now anything that's remaining is something that has not had any cost associated with it. This works for 2D and for 3D. So you can deconstruct your 3D models, you can deconstruct your 2D models. So it makes it a lot easier as a workflow to work with these objects. Also, one of the things I can do, and I'm just going to take this back to, in this case, let's group our estimate by CSI now. What I wanted to show is I've got a handful of columns. I have a handful of fields pulled out in my takeoff summary, and right now I'm grouping by his map, but it could be down here as well. It doesn't really matter where it's located, but just to make it a little easier to see, one of the new things that we've also added is the ability to see the transparency between your quantity takeoff and your costs. It's something we've always been working to improve. I think it could get even better than it is now, but it's better now than it's ever been before. And what that means is you want to know what cost is associated with your takeoff, and you want to know in your estimate what takeoff is associated with your costing. So we are actively kind of charging forward to make sure that we can provide that information to you. And one of the ways that we've done that here, if I select anything inside of this list, so here's my, let me just go to this current drawing. So I've selected the carpet tile for my drawing that we're currently viewing. If I right click here, I can say, hey, show me the associated cost. And what that does is it instantly creates a brand new filter and drives directly to that filter. Now, I'm going to shift over to my estimate view. Typically, our users will have these on separate monitors or at least side by side. As I was talking about before, I'm a little constrained for space. But what that does is it instantly filters my estimate to show me the cost associated with just what I selected inside of the takeoff summary. This could be one item. It could be a series of line items and assemblies. But it's going to instantly create a filter and then filter that estimate accordingly. This also highlights another change that I want to show you that we did inside of 2017-3.0. For those of you who are existing clients and users of our software, you'll remember that when I wanted to see the cost of any one of these takeoff components, I'd select on this, I'd go to the properties, and there were a couple of little buttons right here, a couple little tabs that you could select on to say, show me the assemblies or the line items that are associated with this, in this case, carpet or tile, composite tile. So we've taken those away. And the reason why we took those away is that it seemed redundant, right? You've got this list of costs, you've got these line items and assemblies, but you can't do anything with it other than just view, hey, these are the line items and these are the assemblies that are associated with this takeoff. And it had some basic properties. And what we've gone to now is to better integrate the system that we already have in place for working with those costs, which are our estimate view. So we've taken it away from here and given you a very, very fast way of driving directly to the cost inside of our estimate view through right-click context menu and creating a filter. So now this information is exactly the information that you would have seen when you right-clicked and looked at the properties of any quantity takeoff, plus all of the additional information for those cost items, and you can now actually make changes. So before, when you couldn't make any edits to the price, or you couldn't change the description or edit WBS properties or any of that stuff, now you have the ability to jump right to the cost, make all the edits you want. It's tied in with the existing system, so it's a heck of a lot easier to learn. So this should make things a lot smoother moving forward for all of our users. Now, conversely, let's say I pick on an item and I want to see where in the world did this quantity come from. So this is driving that transparency the other way now. So I want to know kind of like, how did we get here? In the previous versions, you couldn't recreate the quantity takeoff. You couldn't recreate what was going on when the estimator did the takeoff, when they associated the quantities with this item. Now you can. So now what we've got is not only do we have the ability to associate quantity takeoff to a line item, which in the past was an update takeoff button. That update takeoff has now been renamed to map takeoff. This pretty much behaves the exact same way. It allows you to associate different, new, however you want it, quantity takeoff objects with your existing cost items. So if I click map takeoff, it's going to take this vinyl composite tile. So I've got this VCT here, and it's going to associate it with any selected quantity takeoff that I currently have selected inside of my takeoff view. So on one page or multiple pages, it'll associate that. We also now have this review takeoff. So I can click review takeoff, and it's going to recreate what was going on at the time when that takeoff was done. So I can now see that this VCT was derived by mapping the area property of these components with this line item. And I could make changes to this quantity, but at the very least, I can see, okay, this is what it was associated with. There's a couple of pieces of information here that's really subtle that you didn't have before that have been added to really help clarify that. So, okay, so what VCT? Well, in this case, it's the VCT on the second floor of the main building. So this information right here, this is the kind of behind the scenes. This is all the sticky WBS properties that were also associated at the time of the takeoff. So I can clearly see what quantities I selected, where it came from, all that kind of stuff, what was mapped, what parametric properties were mapped, and then what the cost was. And I can make changes if I want to and hit update, or I can just hit cancel because I answered my question. I know that quantity came from. That's something we did not have before, is the ability to recreate that and to say, hey, this is where that quantity came from. Now, this is another one of those features that we've got a lot of really great ideas on, and this is one of the first or probably third steps that we have along a very long path to make this even better. So, kind of watch this space. This is going to get even cooler, even better, a lot easier to use, a lot more functionality, especially as our new team estimating platform is going to roll in. I think this is awesome, and it's going to only get better from here. One of the other things, just kind of while I'm looking at the estimate view, while we're here, that I wanted to point out, there's a handful of things, and I hate to admit it, but we don't always do the greatest job of developing perfect features every time. We'll probably continue to develop features that miss the mark a little bit in the future, but I definitely respect everybody for giving us solid feedback on how to make this better. One of the things that would drive people crazy for all of our existing users is this idea that when I change a quantity, it's going to make it orange. And the reason why we did that is because we wanted to have a clear indication, a clear visual indicator to say, despite having answered the questions and despite having done quantity takeoff and done mapping, somebody at some point came in and decided, I don't care what that quantity formula said or what answers to the questions were given. I want to come in and I want to change 8,300, 10 linear feet to 8,400. Right? And so we initially thought, well, we should show that. We should show when somebody has decided to make direct edits to the quantities. And although our intent was good, I felt like our heart was in the right place. That was an epic miss on our part. That does work. There are times when you do want to know that information, but on the whole, you don't always want to see that. And for a lot of estimators, especially because you want to have a clean estimate, because there's a lot of things that you need to quantify that aren't drawn or aren't there or weren't asked, and you had to make changes, you end up with an estimate that's got a whole orange column on quantity. So what we've given you the ability to do is to turn it off. As a matter of fact, it's turned off by default now. So we still have the ability to color it orange, but if I come in here and I say this is 8,500, actually that's a roll-up item, let me get something else. So in this case, I'm going to say 7,500. If I do that, it'll just change it and it's not orange. Now you can always come back in our preferences. We still have the ability for this show quantity highlighting. I can turn that back on, and it'll go through and it'll highlight the things that I've manually set to be orange. So now if I come back in and I make a change, let's say, that should be. I don't know if I actually changed the quantity. I think it was yelling at me earlier. But that's the basic idea, is that you should be able to toggle this back off and on to show the orange highlighting accordingly. Yeah, I think it's yelling at me. Also, one of the things that we've got while we're here is the ability to toggle off the roll-up. So right now, one of the kind of handy features inside of Estimator is this ability to roll up all of your like items, which gives you the ability to modify unit prices wholesale. So if I wanted to change the price of 3,500 PSI concrete across the entire estimate, I got one place I can come in and change that. And that'll modify it for every single item that is currently rolled up here, as indicated by this little symbol on our row header. If I want, in the past, if I wanted to break out this roll-up, I had to drag out a column that would make each one of these unique. So in the past, that column was typically your takeoff number. Like you have to come in here, you scroll down, we'd find our takeoff number, we drag that out, and now I've got something that uniquely identifies each one of these line items, and you can kind of see it sort of just flattened out the whole estimate. Which is handy, that's great that you can do that, and that's still obviously available today. But it was a lot of steps. And so one of the things you can do is just turn it off completely. And that's done by right-clicking, toggle line item roll up, which is where my quantity was at, by the way. It was still showing rolled up. So now I can toggle that quantity, toggle the line item roll up from here. And so no matter what, no matter how unique these columns are or not, it's not going to roll up the line items. So you do have a surefire way of unrolling all of your cost items inside of your estimate. All right. Let's see, just walking down through the list, turn it orange color. So one of the other things that we've also done while we're on the estimate view is around being able to sum up our formulaic properties. So let's see here. I think I have total labor. I do, as a column. So this column, total labor, this is a custom column that I created. Inside of Estimator, just as a reminder, we have the ability to create any number of additional pieces of data, any number of additional columns that you want to track data on your estimate. And inside of Estimator, you have the ability for those columns to actually calculate themselves. So in this case, total labor, this is a column that you can create. Typically for our clients, if this is important to you, our implementation team likely created this for you. And what this is this going to modify or multiply the quantity of the line item times its labor price to give me the total price of labor for that line item. In the past, and you'll see this now done it for me automatically, but in the past, when I have this item or this column, you could not create totals off of your grouping. So in this case, right now, I'm grouping it by master format level 1. But as you all know, you can drag and drop any amount of columns up here that you want and break your estimate down however you'd like. And now it will automatically total your calculated WBS properties. So all of your formulaic WBS properties can now be calculated. And that actually can be driven very quickly by right-clicking below and hitting sum. And it'll automatically create sums here. Now, that is huge for anybody who's existing, because let me just show you what you used to have to do and what you still can do. Is you used to have to come in, you'd go to this group summary editor, you'd come over, in this case, you'd identify the item you wanted to total, which would be our total cost. So you'd have to go down to total labor. You'd find total labor here. You'd click total labor, all the way down. You click this, you'd come in, you'd add a sum, you'd come in, you'd select this guy, and then you just specify how you want it to show up. Right, so it's a whole lot of steps. So now I've added it and I've formatted it, and that's great. Now all you have to do is right-click, hit sum, boom, it adds it for you. Now one thing you might notice is it doesn't do the formatting for you, and man, that would be a pain if I had to come in and do the formatting every time I wanted to show this summed up value for total labor. So another piece of functionality that we've added is that we now remember all of these summations inside of the layouts. We didn't used to do that before. When you used to save a layout in your estimate view, it would just save the groupings, the columns that were visible, the width of those visibilities, and how they were sorted, along with any coloring that you've applied to the text or the background. But we now also add all of these additional properties here. So now you'll actually save, if I wanted to, I can say, hey, this is going to be my, in the format level 1, and I've summed labor. So now I can go back to that. So if I drag that off and I come back and I say, you know what, I want to go back to my uniform at level 1, it brings that back. It brings back the summing, and it also brings back the formatting that I've applied to that summation for each one of those groups. The last thing I want to show before we kind of end this, and I will say there's probably another 15 sets of features around interacting with groups, so I didn't kind of explain some of these groups here. That's really handy. But the last thing I wanted to show, or the last two things I want to show, one is the ability now to edit the productivity inside of the estimate view. That was added in our 2017 2.0 release and further enhanced in our 2017 3.0 release. So what I'm going to do is bring out my column chooser. We haven't talked much about rates and resources. That was a big feature that was added earlier this year. But how we interact with our rate tables and resource groups, which if you think of crews. But let me take up my labor productivity for a second. All right, so here I've got, in this case, I only have 3 items in my current estimate whose costs are driven by a crew. And then in this, they've got a particular productivity of 10 cubic yards an hour. Now, what we can do, I'm just going to show you under the hood what this looks like. If I select this item and hit modification, that same item. So you can see it and a little bit more information that we currently show in the estimate view. Then you can see that its labor cost is driven by a concrete crew, and you can see its productivity as 10 cubic yards per hour. For this one, you've always had this ability. I can switch this, right? So I can say, hey, in 1 hour, I can do 10 cubic yards. So I'm going to hit OK just to show you that when you do that now, that representation changes. So I can see that for this guy, I can do 1 hour, 10 cubic yards. This guy can do 10 cubic yards an hour. Now, this is exactly equal, so there's not going to change the pricing. And I'm just doing this just so I can show you the difference between how this is going to behave. The difference in 2017 3.0 is now when I go to edit this, I can now edit the number of hours it takes me to do 10 cubic yards. Or if I click here, I can edit the number of cubic yards, I can do it in an hour. So if I did, hey, I can do 20 cubic yards in an hour, and here it's going to take me 1.5 hours to do 10 cubic yards. That is a whole different way of thinking about and driving price for your line items. Now, obviously, this is probably a horrible example for when you would switch it, because this is probably not how you would think about pouring concrete. But if you've got something like you've got project managers on site where you are, your superintendents, and you're pricing them by the hour, and they can do 40 hours a week or 60 hours a week, that's when you would flip it. Because the unit of measure for your line items is likely driven by weeks, but you don't necessarily think about how much of a week a given project manager could do in an hour, right? So that idea doesn't make sense, but when you switch it, it kind of makes a lot more sense to see it that way. It also makes a heck of a lot more sense to edit it that way. So if I need to make wholesale changes on how much a person is going to be able to work on this project, I want to be able to say this is how many hours in a day or a week they're going to be able to work, and not try to do the math and figure it out and then type in the percentage of week that's going to break down to. That doesn't make much sense. So you can now do that here. The last thing I wanted to point out is some changes that we've done to the work on add assembly and line item. So here, if I pick assembly, let's just go, I think I've got a slab on grade here, so let's look at that. As always, when you select a cost item to add, especially from the estimate view, you can see all of the instances that have ever been added before. And you can see, you can always go back in and select on any one of these instances and make changes to them. And it'll actually pre-fill the takeoff questions here. So I can say, hey, what do we do to get to this particular takeoff? If I select it here, it's going to pre-answer the questions the way that it was here. And now I can add a new one to basically match that takeoff. Or I can make changes to it and hit update and actually update that existing takeoff object, or the existing assembly. The thing that I wanted to point out is that the information you used to see here wasn't all that helpful. It would be the number of the assembly, unless you bothered to go in and manually change that to something more meaningful, which I don't think any estimator has the time to do. Now what you'll see is all of the information that you thought was important to identify this assembly at the time of takeoff, which is the assembly name, as well as all of the WBS properties. So right now, if I want to, at the time I took this off, I put these on floor 1, but I didn't have the system WBS property available. But if I take this off now and I say, okay, I want to put this on main building floor 2, let's just go ahead and add that. Now I can see that this is a slab on grade for main building floor 2. So we saw a little bit of a flavor of this earlier when we were reviewing the takeoff. And then you can see it here as well. So now I can much more easily identify what in the heck these costs were associated with and what this assembly actually means. It's the same way for the line items as well. And so now it'll break this down based off of whatever the current WBS properties that are sticky are. So I can change this. I can go in and I can give values for system here, and they will show up here. And if I make changes to what I consider important to track for location or for whatever buckets I want to break my estimate down in, by changing the sticky WBS properties, it will update accordingly here, so that you aren't stuck with whatever information's here. If all of a sudden something else becomes important, or we make changes, or I realize I just totally messed up and I forgot to set certain properties as sticky earlier, I can come back in, set it as sticky now, and then boom, these will automatically update. So you're not having to go back in and redo any work to get to make sense for you at a later date, it'll automatically have that information. I think that's as far as I want to go for 2017 3.0. Everything else is about 100 bug fixes and a whole bunch of smaller features in and around, you know, just how we interact with the application. But if you've got some time, we can open up for some questions.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Thank you, Mike. So I know we are a little bit over, so we do want to respect y'all's time. If you do have any questions, though, we will stick around for a few more minutes. Mike, I do have one just kind of over the Industry Advisory Board and feedback. So sort of a two-part question. I know you mentioned that this version was directly driven from the Industry Advisory Board. So how would someone get involved in that? And then also, do you have to be involved in that to give feedback for a future version?
Two really good questions. So let me go back to front. No, you don't have to be involved in the Industry Advisory Board to give feedback. Clearly not. We will take feedback from anywhere we can get it. The Industry Advisory Board is just a formalization of that. It allows us to have regular meetings. It kind of gives you the ability. It's kind of like you have a reserved spot to be able to provide that feedback and a good time to do that. The Industry Advisory Board provides more than just the ability to provide feedback. Those guys are also you know, working with super early versions of the software. We are pinging them on a regular basis because they have identified themselves as people who are passionate about specific sections of technology or of the industry. And so they're the ones we're emailing or calling, you know, when we have questions on, hey, how should this work? Does this look right? That kind of thing. But certainly, if you've got ideas and you want to provide feedback, but you don't have the time to be a part of the Industry Advisory Board, that's 100% acceptable. There are any way you can find to get to Beck Technology is an okay way. We do have a handful of emails. We have support at Beck-Technology. We've got our community, which I'm a huge fan of, so beck-technology.com/community. So all of those are out there. Please provide your feedback. Talk to your account representative. If you're an existing client, obviously you've entered our engagement program, so we have an engagement team. That person's responsibility is to make sure that our tech works for you now and our tech works for you 10 years from now. So if you've got ideas on things that should be in there and you're an existing client, certainly reach out to your engagement person. That's one of the biggest reasons why they're there, is to make sure that our technology fits what you need. But yeah, support, engagement, sales, you can contact me directly. I'm 100% fine with that. The community, again, the community is such a great place. If you haven't been there, that place you can throw out an idea and your peers can actually help you build that idea into something even better. So that's one of the things where I really love the community, is that it kind of bubbles up and matures and can become something even greater than you may have initially thought it could be. So all different ways you can reach us, and you certainly don't need to be a member.
Okay. Well, I will definitely put a link to the community and how they can get involved on the recording email. With that, I will go ahead and wrap this presentation up, but wanted to thank Mike and thank everyone for attending this webinar on the new upcoming features of 3.0. Thank you, Mike.
Cheers. Thank you, guys. Thank you for attending.